The discovery and subsequent colonization of Brazil. The Tupi of coastal Brazil. The natives of coastal Brazil had much in common with the people of the Caribbean. The Tupi lived very simply, and each village was largely self-sufficient. Tupi settlements usually had from 400 to 800 inhabitants. Labor was divided by gender. Men felled trees, hunted and fished, while women planted and harvested crops. The Tupi were aggressive people who often fought among themselves. Prisoners were then sacrificed and eaten, but not before they had been carried back to their captives' homes and subjected to public humiliation by the women of the village. The Portuguese in Brazil. Like Columbus and the Caribbean, Portuguese navigators were on their way to Asia when they first made landfall in Brazil. The first Portuguese fleet arrived in Brazil in 1500. The Portuguese commander, Pedro Álvares Cabral's fleet of 13 vessels set sail intending to follow up on Vasco da Gama's successful voyage bound for India. Cabral was sailing from Portugal down the west coast of Africa and around its southern tip to the Indian Ocean. To catch the best winds, either by design or by accident, Cabral pursued a more westward course, and he swung out into the South Atlantic and bumped into Brazil. He didn't know exactly what he had found. He believed it was an island, but he knew that it was not India. He and his crew spent 8 days ashore, and after naming Brazil the Terra de la Veracruz, or Island of the True Cross, he hurried on to his original destination and sent one ship back to Portugal with the news of the discovery. Although in 1501 the Portuguese would return, Brazil seemed unimportant to the Portugal at the time. A few years earlier, the Portuguese had established a route to the fabled riches of South Asia. Portuguese ships returned to Europe overloaded with silks and porcelain, precious stones and spices, pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon, and Persian horses, not to mention gold and silver. This made Portugal for a time a major player in world history. For the rest of the 1500s, the Portuguese concentrated on their early advantage in the Far Eastern trade. Portuguese outposts elsewhere reached from Africa to Arabia, India, Indonesia, China, and Japan. Brazil offered nothing comparable to India in the eyes of the Portuguese. According to Portuguese sailors, the Brazilian shores presented a vision of a new Garden of Eden, paying particular attention to the fact that the indigenous people there wore no clothes. Their lack of interest in accumulating personal possessions mystified 16th century Europeans. One observer noted that among the Tupi, in every house they all live together in harmony, with no dissension between them. They are so friendly that what belongs to one belongs to all. Don't get me wrong, Portuguese sailors found indigenous women attractive and inviting, but the only thing that seemed to have potential for sale in Europe was a red dye made from the Brazil wood tree. That was the only commodity of any value the Portuguese found, Brazil wood, a dye wood long used by the Tupi to color their cotton fabrics, and the name of this export quickly replaced the original name of the Island of the True Cross. The Brazil wood tree, which gives Brazil its name, has dark, valuable wood and provides red dye. For the next 2 decades, the European presence in Brazil consisted of simple trading posts staffed with just a few individuals, similar to those that they had set up in Africa. Natives cut the dye woods and traded them for European tools. And so the Crown's attention focused on developing its commercial empire in Asia, and there really was little reason to set up an elaborate government for a colony that yielded only dye woods. However, Europeans of the 1500s believed in the teachings of their religion, and Portuguese and Spanish men, especially those in holy orders such as the Jesuits, they undertook quite perilous voyages around the world. The idea of spreading Christianity was the rationale for laying claims to huge chunks of the world. This was a time of what is considered the most notable example of religious imperialism in history. Within a century, the armies of Islam had conquered a territory larger than that of Rome in its height, extending from India to North America. Europeans, of course, they knew that they had to go out and, of course, find converts. Forest dwellers like the Tupi, didn't have very much that the Europeans wanted, so they were first more or less left alone. Along the Brazilian coast, trade developed with Tupi men who cut Brazil wood and floated the logs to trading stations in return for useful items such as steel axes. Occasionally, Portuguese castaways or exiles went native to live among the indigenous people and fathered dozens and dozens of children, beginning the process of racial mixing that had characterized the history of Brazil. The king of Portugal was too preoccupied with the Asian Empire to think much about Brazil until the 1530s, when the appearance of French ships along the Brazilian coast made him fear for his claims there. King Manuel I and John III relied on private entrepreneurs to explore and defend their American claims, but this proved ineffective at keeping French interlopers from setting up fortified trading posts along the coast. After a series of unsuccessful expeditions failed to dislodge the French, King John sent a large expedition to establish a more permanent presence at San Vicente, about 300 miles southwest of present-day Rio de Janeiro. And so in order to secure his claims, he finally sent Portuguese settlers to Brazil. Suddenly, the Portuguese did want something that the Tupi possessed: their land. Now everything would change. To the Portuguese, settling the land meant clearing the forests and planting crops, and sugarcane was the only crop with major export potential. It could be boiled, milled, and then of course concentrated into imperishable blocks packed in wooden chests that could easily fit into the small sailing ships of the day. And it brought a high price in Europe, where sugarcane did not grow. This made sugarcane the cash crop for centuries, first in Brazil and later in the Caribbean. Sugar was a plantation crop requiring a large, cheap labor force, but no Portuguese settler wanted to provide that cheap agricultural labor. As for Tupi men, they traditionally hunted and fished and regarded farming as women's work. Why should indigenous men or women chop cane for small wages under the burning sun when the forest gave them everything that they wanted? To gain the land and labor of the forest people like the Tupi, the Portuguese resorted to force of arms. This meant attacking and enslaving each tribal group of a few hundred, one by one, in bloody battles. Many factors made the task hard to do. The invaders' horses, what was a secret weapon for the Europeans because they did not exist in America before the encounter, well, they could hardly move amid the hanging vines, the fallen trunks of trees, the tangled roots. Also, the forest provided countless opportunities to hide, to escape, and to ambush pursuers. And if not supervised constantly, even after they were defeated, native Brazilians would escape into the woodlands beyond the plantations. In other words, extracting land and labor from semi-sedentary forest dwellers like the Tupi meant totally destroying their society and enslaving them. Most were likely to die in the process. And this is exactly what happened all along the coast of Brazil once the Portuguese began to establish sugar plantations. King John attempted to promote colonization along the length of Brazil's coastline. In an attempt to settle 2,000 miles of coastline, the king parceled out enormous slices to wealthy individuals called captains who promised to colonize and rule in his name. He divided the coast into 15 captaincies and granted them to proprietors known as donatarios, who had proven their loyalty to the crown through service in Portugal's settlements in India. The donatario could recruit colonists, make land grants, found cities, administer justice, and collect taxes, and receive a percentage of the profits from the trade in the native slaves and the dyewoods within his jurisdiction. Most captaincies failed for reasons that included hostility from local Indians, poor administration, and internal dissension among the colonies. A few proprietary colonies prospered, however. The most successful sugar plantations were those who minimized conflict with indigenous people. For example, Pernambuco, on the very northeastern tip of Brazil, became the model sugar captaincy, partly because the family of its captain established an alliance by marriage with the local chief. And it was the captaincy at Pernambuco in the north that helped solidify the Portuguese presence in Brazil. Proprietor Duarte Coelho Pereira recruited settlers, expanded the region's economic base, first from dyewoods to then include sugar production. And he cultivated good relations with Indians in Pernambuco, and it was his brother-in-law who married the daughter of a local chief and encouraged other colonies to do likewise. The colonization of Brazil. During the first 30 years after Cabral's arrival, when Portuguese settlers were few in number, the natives retained substantial control over their interaction with foreigners. They cut dyewoods when and where they pleased and exchanged it for tools from Europe. Later donatarios and their entourages disrupted this simple barter economy, as aspiring sugar planters enslaved the natives and appropriated their lands. By the mid-1540s, indigenous rebellions threatened to erupt up and down the coast, and so in 1548 the Portuguese king stepped up the colonization of Brazil by appointing a royal governor and a building of the capital city, Salvador, which is also called Bahia. Over the next half century, between the planters' efforts to enslave the Tupi people and certain disastrous efforts to protect them, the Tupi vanished from the area of sugar plantations. The ecological conquest. Plants, animals, and unseen microbes that crossed the Atlantic with the human settlers would bring about a transformation of the natural environment unprecedented in human history. Particularly lethal were European diseases against which indigenous people had no natural resistance. Periodic episodes of smallpox, measles, influenza, plague, and typhus took thousands of lives and severely disrupted native societies. Even those who survived an epidemic would become its victims. And when illness struck at a certain point in the agricultural cycle, few hands were available to plant and harvest, and famine loomed. Malnourished and weakened by the invaders' excessive labor demands, native people were in turn left more vulnerable to the next outbreak of disease. And because the epidemics took so many adults in their prime of their reproductive years, birth rates plummeted in native societies, and children who might have had pretty much no one to take care for them. Coastal Brazil lost an estimated 95% of its aboriginal population during the 16th century, so that by 1600, only about 5,000 Tupi survived. The vast majority, 90% or more of the early immigrants to Brazil were male, and most were relatively young in their 20s and 30s, and this preponderance of males, together with a conquest mentality that encouraged both forcible and consensual sex with Indian women, resulted in the birth of racially mixed children called mamelucos in Brazil. The impact of evangelization. The first black-robed Jesuits came to Brazil and established special villages to teach the indigenous Christianity and defend them from enslavement. They tried to save the indigenous populations from enslavement. Nevertheless, epidemic European diseases decimated the indigenous inhabitants of Jesuit villages. All over Americas, the indigenous populations were fast disappearing, and to replace them, the Portuguese bought slaves in Africa and crowded them into the holds of Brazilian-bound ships. By 1600, Africans were rapidly replacing indigenous people as the enslaved workforce of the Brazilian sugar plantations. The surviving Tupi either fled into the interior or intermarried and gradually disappeared as a distinct group.